Well, there we go. My name's Todd O'Hair, and I've got Bridger Mahlum here, our Director of Government Affairs for the Montana Chamber of Commerce. And if you'll notice, Bridger's not wearing a tie today.
Let the neck breathe, baby.
Oh, it's interesting. Well, let me first start by noting that we record the first part of this session, and we'll stop the recording as soon as Bridger and I finish our dialogue and open up to any questions that we might get. As early as late last week, there were some rumors and talk that they might actually wrap as early as Thursday. I think most of us thought, no way. But here we wrapped up at what, 4 o'clock yesterday, 4:30, something like that, late in the afternoon?
Yeah, Todd. So the legislature adjourned sine die on the 80th legislative day yesterday afternoon. And yeah, at first, when I was hearing the rumors, that's how it always goes with these legislative sessions. There's people hedging that they're gonna have like this many days left, and they're gonna call it here, et cetera. But there's always something that holds it up for a little bit. And there was a microcosm of that yesterday. There was a little bit of last minute debate and discussion on regulating and implementing a recreational marijuana program and industry in the state. But yeah, Todd, they wrapped things up.
Done. So we put out a press release yesterday, notice to our members. The title was, it was countless wins for the Montana business community. We certainly can't go through all the wins here today, but this was a significant legislative session as far as really checking a lot of the boxes in the business community that were important. Can you kind of touch on some of those, Bridger?
Yeah, Todd, and I truly was toiling over this press release because countless is the right term. I think it cannot be overstated, whether it's this video or however else we talk about it in the months to come, that we accomplished more in this session for business than frankly we have in many others leading up to this combined. And I would say that isn't an indication of the Montana Chamber's influence. We've always been the leading voice for business, but there was some changing in some political dynamics this go around, and there really was there was a lane for us to take this session on legal reform and employment law, and we seized that opportunity with preparation over the summer leading up to session and getting some incredible wins when it comes to making our legal climate more predictable for business. And I highlighted a few things in that press release. Obviously, enacting COVID-19 liability protections for business was the kind of reassurance that Montana businesses needed at a most uncertain time in this economy and for families as well. House Bill 254 was work that I had worked with attorneys in the employment arena who represent business in the months leading up to session to figure out how do we modernize Montana's unique wrongful discharge from employment act, and we were able to pull that off with some comprehensive reform there. Senate Bill 251, one of our big tort reform bills related to phantom damages, clarifying that medical expense damages and personal injury lawsuits should be limited to the amounts actually paid to healthcare providers. And that's going to bring down the cost of lawsuits for businesses. And that's really a big deal for us. And then finally, as far as our core four are concerned, Todd, we reined in property owner liability when it comes to unwanted trespasses on that property, whether it's a piece of land you own as a business or a piece of machinery that's also included as part of your property. These are the kind of things that we've been waiting a long time to get done for business, and to do it now. And Todd, we talk about countless wins. It's also countless people to thank. And I wouldn't even know where to start there. Obviously, your leadership with the chamber coming into this position just a couple years ago here and helping guide this organization through one of its most successful legislative sessions of all time is huge. And not only that, but the rest of our team here, working on every aspect of the process, to all the way from communicating our wins to interfacing with members about what we're getting done. And the legislators, obviously, big time key legislators were there for us on so many of these issues. The Gianforte administration, of course, was a great backstop on everything that we were working on, and interfacing with his team throughout the process. And other stakeholders. It's not just the chamber that gets these things done, but it's also the other trade associations and advocacy groups that we partner with to create a groundswell of support for the things that we could do. So countless wins and countless people to thank, Todd. It's been awesome.
Yeah, and I think it's been we've seen a real unique relationship with the governor's office coming into the session, where they've sought out the Montana Chamber's opinion and thoughts on different pieces of legislation. We've consulted with them regularly on our core 4 pieces of legislation. And so while you checked off 4 boxes there that were significant in the tax or in the tort reform area, there was also some wins in the tax arena that I think particularly small businesses are going to see some possible impacts in their taxes going forward.
Yeah, Todd, outside of individual income tax reductions, which based on our income tax structure, that's going to impact a lot of working people that make that like it's like $18,000 or above. You're at like 6.9%, and a couple bills this session are going to ratchet that down for some significant savings for everybody that makes money above that. So very exciting news there for economic development that way. But I'd also highlight, of course, business equipment tax relief. That's been a bread and butter issue for the Montana Chamber for as long as that tax has been around. And we consider it a punitive tax. It's unique among regional competitors when it comes to attracting investment. And we played an important role in that proposal from the governor's office to get that passed. And so now your first $300,000 of market value equipment is tax-free on that separate tax. So it's taking thousands of small manufacturers and other types of businesses off the rolls for that completely. So that's super exciting. And it isn't even just limited to taxes, Todd. I mean, it's across the board, and just going through what's really going to be important here. And another bill that I hadn't talked a whole lot about this session as it went through the process, House Bill 246. And this is going into where we can make strides in workforce development in the legislative process. And this was a bill that had lifted some regulations to allow experienced tradespeople to teach. And obviously, teacher certification is an important process. You want to make sure you have the right people that can teach and know how to interface with students. But there just was some unnecessary hurdles for people who have 20, 30 years in a trade, working in a trade and know the ins and outs of everything about that process, to be able to get those people who are interested, involved in teaching, and to share their knowledge and pass it down to the next generation is going to prepare our next generation of workers. And so that's just one other example of the many bills that we got involved in this session to move business forward in our state.
There's been some laughing that's kind of gone on with the conclusion of the legislature, that there were so many significant business wins that it's probably going to take some time to completely get your arms around what all happened during the session, as far as being able to put together a full and a comprehensive tally of all the significant business wins. But as you pointed out, it ranges all the way from tort reform to workforce development, which we're seeing, while it's always been a big issue for the state for a number of years now, it's increasingly a bigger issue right now as we see unemployment rates at 3.8% in the state, and it's getting to be a bigger and bigger issue. So some of those are nicer mid to long-term sort of solutions to address the problem, but we're making some advances on a number of business priorities in this last legislative session.
Yeah, Todd, you mentioned just the number of bills that being involved in this process. Obviously, there's just so much to go through, and I'll just, at a high level, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to discuss just a few numbers here to really try to put a pin in how involved we were across the spectrum of bills, because we represent the entire spectrum of business. So there were just over 1,300 bills, resolutions, et cetera, introduced in this legislative session. That means there were all those were heard in some capacity, whether they got all the way through the process or were killed in the first committee. But that being said, over 300 of those have already been signed by the governor. Another 300 plus have just gotten to his desk over the past few days. and now those are big numbers, of course, but how involved is the chamber and all those as far as the numbers were concerned? And I looked at as far as the bills, Todd, that we were directly involved in, the chamber was involved in about 100 bills, whether it was supporting them directly or opposing them directly, because playing defense is always a big part of any legislative session, preventing bad stuff from hurting Montana's business climate. And yeah, we were in about 60 odd bills that we think were going to be good for business. And I think all but maybe like 2 or 3 of those got through. And so I think it's just a reflection of the influence we have to be involved in that swath of legislation. But the fact that we got our 4 most important priorities through the process, and really they weren't sitting around at the end of the session to be played with either. We got them through in a timely fashion. Just shows that while we're the voice for all business, we also brought a narrow focus on things that we know are going to have a major impact and got them done. So we were able to have our cake and eat it too. It home run after home run.
Yeah, I think you bring up an important point about the number of bills that we played defense on. There was a couple of examples where, especially as the session ground on a little bit, where a bill would escape a chamber, like pass out of the House because there was no opposition to it and land over in the Senate. And suddenly, it'd be left to the Montana chamber, in some cases, to be the sole opponent to a piece of legislation that was going to provide some additional regulations and burden on businesses. And so we would go in and articulate a case to the committee members on that committee. And we had a number of those bills that we saw that got tabled in that committee. So we talked more about the wins as we were going through this legislative session, because there were a lot of wins, and we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the success that we had in defending business against some of the bright ideas sometimes that come that really aren't the best interest of Montana business.
Yeah, I'd say, and just to keep that at a relatively high level, I think some of the main things that we were involved in to play defense on and prevent were things like impractical paid leave and minimum wage increases, legislation that would have increased work comp premiums. There've been a few sneaky bills every session that could really have an adverse impact on your work comp premiums, and that's a required cost of doing business. And so we want to always keep that in check and as predictable as possible. And then obviously preventing major tax increases, some of those were proposed as well. And any unnecessary regulation, let's keep this at a place where government has limited involvement in doing business in our states, so that we can continue to encourage that economic growth. And so, yeah, we were definitely involved in preventing some bad bills, but it's always harder to pass bills than it is to stop them. And so the fact that we were able to get so many more good bills through than having to spend as much time preventing bad bills is a reflection of just how focused this legislature and the governor were on creating a more pro-business climate in our state.
Well, the session's wrapped, and you don't have another theoretical legislative session for another 2 years almost, year and a half, a little bit. The interim's coming up. There's going to be a lot of activity in the interim with ARPA funds and distributing some of those sort of monies into certain projects. Anything else, even though it's really early, it's not even 24 hours after the session is concluded, anything else that you can kind of see on the horizon in the interim that is a result of this legislative session that we need to keep an eye on and be involved with?
Yeah, Todd, and there were several legislative interim studies that passed the session, and a lot of them really towards the end here. So frankly, we didn't get a chance to digest all of them, but what's going to be next in that process is the legislators will be polled on all of those studies that were passed, and they're going to rank them all. And based on what feedback comes back from that polling, there will only be so many studies done, because they pass more studies than the interim committees have the capacity to actually complete. And so we're gonna be lobbying lawmakers on which studies we think are most important when it comes to diving deeper into issues that can drive Montana's economy even further. So we're going to be on those study bills, be involved that way throughout the legislative interim. But Todd, you hit on what's going to be making this interim so unique is that those federal COVID-19 relief ARPA dollars have been allocated to these interim commissions that I think are going to be separate from several of the regular legislative interim committees, and are going to start, allocating these funds in a very specific way, and that these folks are expecting the chamber to be involved in advising the best way to spend those dollars, all the way from which infrastructure capital improvement projects should be prioritized to how do we spend some of these workforce development grants that was put in the ARPA funding allocation as well. So it's going to be a very exciting interim, and I think it just goes to show that our work doesn't end at sine die. The Montana Chamber, are your 24/7, 365 business advocate, and we are there for you on the issues every day, whether it's a legislative session, whether it's an interim meeting, whether it's rulemaking of all these bills that pass. We want to make sure that the intent of the legislature is reflected in the rules that are passed afterwards. And at the federal level, there's a lot of change happening at the federal level, and we obviously have great influence with our congressional delegation. We work really well with all of them, and we will continue to work with them on some of those developments that are happening over in DC.
Well, thanks, Bridger. And the success of this legislative session from an organization wouldn't be what it is today if we hadn't had Bridger's leadership leading the government affairs work. And so I want to thank you, Bridger, for leading a really Herculean sort of an effort here, working with different groups, the Montana stock growers and contractors, and with our board of directors. We've got some great board of directors that, has been able to be an important piece of information and advice to us as we went through the session, and having to make some quick decisions at times, and keeping us guided in a correct direction. And so I want to thank all of them as well. And I want to thank all the members of the Montana Chamber of Commerce. We look forward to getting out and talking about some of the great successes and some of the changes that we can start seeing going forward as a result of this legislative session here in 2021.